purple fingers, January of 2005. The Iraqis had to dip their fingers in indelible purple ink when they voted, so they couldn't vote twice. And they were all walking around holding those purple fingers up to the international cameras and talking about what it meant to be able to freely vote for whoever you wanted to vote for after 35 years under Saddam Hussein. We got there. But I'm just here to tell you, it wasn't a given. And that's probably why it's so meaningful. In my mind, as one of the things I'm most proud of, because we gave 25 million people the opportunity for a better life.
Welcome to Combat Story. I'm Ryan Fugit, and I served war zone tours as an Army attack helicopter pilot and CIA officer over a 15-year career. I'm fascinated by the experiences of the elite in combat. On this show, I interview some of the best to understand what combat felt like on their front lines. This is Combat Story. Today we hear a rare combat story from the highest echelons of the military from the eyes of retired General George Casey, who was the commanding general, Multinational Force Iraq from 2004 to 2007, and Chief of Staff of the Army from 2007 to 2011. General Casey's decisions resulted in many of the combat stories we've heard on this show, as Delta operators, snipers, soldiers, and Marines carried out tactical operations that he and his staff decided at those strategic levels. I have a very short but personally important moment in which my life intersected with the general's as he commissioned me into the Army. I was a student and ROTC cadet at Georgetown, where I played football and was on campus during the aftermath of 9/11. Similarly, General Casey was a student at Georgetown, also played football, and was on campus during the Vietnam War, when it was not popular to wear the uniform. Mine was the first full class to commission into the post-9/11 era, and I found it fitting that General Casey was the man who made that possible. He's got some amazing stories that you're about to hear, including being asked to attend the second ever selection course for Delta Force, to creating the conditions for the first ever elections in post-Saddam Iraq decades later. This was a special interview for me personally, and I hope you enjoy the experience, highs, lows, and mindset of one of the very few to ever have the opportunity to wear 4 stars. Sir, thank you for taking the time to share your story with us today.
Great, Ryan. It's probably not going to be nearly as compelling as some of your other stories, but I'll do my best.
Thank you very much. So I think I have to start out. We have a very small common intersection timeline-wise where you commissioned me into the Army in 2002, May of 2002, from Georgetown, where you also went to college. And just learning more about you, there are some similarities there that I really want to dive into, including, I understand you played football at the Hilltop. You had a motorcycle when you were there, first assignments, Germany, all of that, and a war going on at the same time while you were there. I think things start to really differentiate once we get to our units, because you get to an Army that was very different from the one that I moved into as a lieutenant in 2002. But could you talk to us just a little bit about your time at Georgetown? Why did you end up getting to that school?
Sure. I don't know. Do you remember the story I told at the commissioning? Probably not, because no one ever remembers what the commissioning speaker said.
I don't. How bad is this of me?
No, remind me. I'll come back to that.
Yeah.
But how did I get there? I went to a basketball game there when I was a kid, probably, I don't know, 11 or 12. And I was captivated by it. And then we went, my father was in the military, and so he was assigned to Germany. And so we lived over in Germany, and we traveled around quite a bit, just seeing all the history and everything was there. And then they shipped my brother and I off to boarding school in Rome for a year because we were not distinguishing ourselves in the local Dodds school. So I spent a year in school in Rome, my junior year in high school. And again, I got more and more fascinated by the international and by history. And so when it came time to apply to college, Georgetown was the place that I wanted to go. And so I went to 4 high schools in 3 countries. And so my last year was in Boston, at Boston College High School, with the Jesuits. And so I don't know. I think I might have been able to leverage the Jesuit connection to buck up my application to get into Georgetown. But I was accepted into the Foreign Service School, which is just where I wanted to go. And interestingly, when I went in, I knew I was going to be in ROTC because we were at war in Vietnam and it was my duty to serve. So I knew I was going to do that. But I had half a mind that I was going to wind up in the Foreign Service. And then as I progressed on through college, I decided that law school was better. So my original plan was to finish up my 2-year ROTC obligation and get out and go to law school. And that's what I told my bride. Didn't quite work out that way.
No, reading more about you, it feels like it was always just maybe another 2 years here, maybe another 2 years.
Yeah, exactly.
Ended up being many more.
Yeah.
I was also in the School of Foreign Service there, just as a connection. Do you happen to recall what dorm you lived in, just by any chance back then?
Yeah, sure. Freshman year, I was in Xavier, which was over on the East Campus, and it was right. I forget whether it's 36. It might be 36th Street, but it's the one that goes straight into that cobblestone hill that goes down to the Potomac River, right by Dixie Liquor.
Yeah, which doesn't change. Dixie Liquor.
But I remember that because in 1968, I stood on the roof of that dorm and watched Washington burn after the assassination of Martin Luther King, and I'll never forget that. I mean, just billowing clouds of black smoke all across the horizon in Washington. It was staggering.
Wow. It's interesting. In 2001 on 9/11, I remember I had a moped, not a motorcycle, but I drove it so I could get line of sight to the Pentagon to see the smoke coming off of the building as well. And I still remember that to this day, that moment.
Yeah. I was down in Suffolk, Virginia, at the head of the Joint Warfighting Center. And I was sitting in my office having my meeting with a couple of my direct reports, and secretary came in and said, "Turn the TV on, a plane has hit one of the Twin Towers." And so we turned it on and said, "Oh, some guy must have had a heart attack and flown the plane in there." And then when we saw the other plane come in, we knew we were at war.
Yeah. You mentioned your father. Love to spend just a bit of time there. If it's not too difficult, I know it's not an easy story at all, but would love to touch more on that. And one of the things that I noticed when I was doing some research was, correct me if this is not accurate, but that he would quiz you and the family at the dinner table as you were growing up about current events and what was going on in the world. So if you could just tell us more about your father and that story.
Sure. So it's a fascinating family story that his grandfather came from Ireland on the 4th of July, 1871, into New York. And he kind of hung around New York for a while and then got a job as a stonecutter up in New London, Connecticut. He made enough money to marry a Boston girl. They had 7 children, 4 boys, 3 girls. All of them went to college.
Wow. And
my dad's father went to Colby College and Columbia Medical School, became a doctor, and was the head of surgery at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Boston for years. He also married my grandfather also married a Boston girl, and they had 7 children, 5 boys and 2 girls. All 5 boys went to Harvard, and all 5 boys served. 3 of them served in World War II. My father and one of his brothers served in Korea, and he served in Vietnam. And that's kind of what big families did back then. But it was the city of Boston actually just dedicated a memorial to him about 400 yards from his house in Allston, which is right next to. It's actually in the park is in the shadow of Harvard Stadium. We very, very nice gesture by them. And we
to your grandfather, sir. To your grandfather?
My father.
To your father. Wow.
My father, yeah.
Oh, Did I
But
get this right? He went to Harvard and then to West Point, no?
he went to Harvard for a year and then left and went to West Point. And that time they were commissioning in 3 years. And he was the captain of the West Point hockey team, and climbed the ladder and was commanding the 1st Cavalry Division when he was killed in Vietnam.
Would you mind? I can't imagine what that was like when that happened, but some of what I've read, the story of him leaving to go on that deployment.
Yeah.
I mean, you're in a very formative point of your life, junior or senior in college at the time. Is that right, sir? When that happens?
Yeah, I was a senior in college. I was graduating. I wanted to drive him up to the airport because I wanted to let him know that I was getting married to the girl that he just had met and spent a couple of days with in the family. And as we were, I'll never forget it. We kind of walked out to the gate, and we watched him walking up the stairs onto the plane. And my mother and I just stood there and kept watching and watching until he disappeared. And I looked at my mother and I said, "This must get easier for you because you've done it so much." And she just looked at me with tears in her eyes and she said, "No, it only gets harder." And I went, "Wow." And she was right. It does only get harder. Mm.
One of the people I interviewed very early in this process was a chief warrant officer who I served with in Afghanistan, a fantastic pilot. And he ended up having a few kids, and the oldest was then in Iraq, 2017, Iraq, Afghanistan, like in the same places he had fought before. And he had deployed 4 times himself. And he said, without question, watching a family member deploy is far harder than deploying yourself.
Yeah, we lived it when my son got called up and went to Afghanistan. Yeah, it is harder, especially a child.
Yeah. So I am curious, and one thing I don't know if it's out there, but do you think that what happened to your father, him passing away the way he did in Vietnam, do you think your career would have gone differently if he had not passed away? Like, what type of an impact did that have on you in terms of your career in the military?
Actually, I was headed out. I was in the mode. I was going to be in the Army to do my obligation and get out and go to law school. And I didn't. I had in my mind I didn't want a perception that I was getting pulled along by my dad. So I decided, I probably would have gotten out and gone to law school. But when he was killed, it was I think it was a bit of a combination of when he was killed, that was removed, and then I got to my first platoon in Germany and found out that I actually loved to lead and I loved soldiers, and went on to develop my great love for the Army.
Yeah. You mentioned obviously in '68 seeing the city like burn basically. Also, you were living through the Vietnam era and some of the protests. A different experience than what I had. But how did that influence your initial move into the Army? Being there for the protests, how did you experience that?
I mean, I can remember, there was a lot of curiosity, and there are these large masses of people, thousands of people coming up marching on Washington. So we would go out and watch and look and just kind of see what was going on. And I guess the other thing that caused tension was when we were going to our ROTC drills, walking across campus in uniforms. It wasn't a pleasant experience. A lot of catcalls and stuff like that. But it really, aside from that, and the fact that they closed Georgetown my senior year after Kent State because everybody was marching on Washington. So we had kind of an abbreviated senior year where we had to go around and negotiate our final grades so we could graduate. But I mean, I was never involved in any of the protests or anything out of more than just curiosity of what was going on.
Yeah, I definitely, and I was at Georgetown just before 9/11, obviously. So I kind of experienced the two worlds there. And there was a bit of, I'd walk across campus. I wouldn't get a cat call, but there was a little bit of, he's in the Army. That's silly. And then when 9/11 happened, it was a very different experience. I think, and it wasn't protests. It was people, from my experience, very supportive of what we were getting ready to go do.
Yeah, I actually served on the board at Georgetown for 6 years. I think I just came off in 2021. And what they were doing for veterans, especially with the Yellow Ribbon program around campus, was really remarkable.
I used that program to go back to grad school there, actually, in between my time at the Army and the CIA. So I really benefited from that. So as I had alluded to earlier, the Army that you went into initially was very different from the one I did. I mean, I also went to Germany, actually, to a small base in Bavaria.
I know Hillesheim well. Yeah.
You knew that area?
I was the chief of staff of 5th Corps.
Okay, so you had to know.
So, yeah, right. Even been there.
Have you? I mean, we loved it, and my wife was there with me before we had kids, and things got challenging. We had a great time, but it was a very functioning, effective military unit. And my understanding is the Germany you arrived at was very different, and I was hoping you could talk through some of that.
Yeah, I mean, it was very different, and I was in a position where I was in one of the only airborne unit in Europe, and so we had a lot of the same problems other ones did, but not to the same degree. We had these folks that had enlisted for 3 years, gone to basic training and everything, gone to Vietnam, and then had 12 to 18 months left on their tour, so they sent them to Germany. And there were a lot of alcohol problems, there were a lot of drug problems, and what was interesting to me, I had this one sergeant, Staff Sergeant Flores. I mean, he was the best field soldier in probably maybe in the battalion, but certainly in our company. But he had a terrible drinking problem, and he'd be when he was sober during the day, he was great. Friday and Saturday, he'd go out and get drunk and get in all kinds of troubles. And it never even dawned on me that he might have been suffering severe post-traumatic stress. I did in retrospect, as I think back of it, and I think a lot of it was a result of that. And we dealt with the symptoms, not what was the root cause of all that. So it was a tough time. So it was still, I got there in April of 71. So still lingering racial tensions, to the point where, as a battalion duty officer, we were armed. I mean, we had a loaded .45. And then at one point, there were the racial tensions at Lee Barracks in Mainz got so significant that we had armed duty officers in the companies as well as in the battalion. So you had a lieutenant and a sergeant, a senior sergeant at battalion, and you had lieutenants and senior sergeants in the companies, and everybody was armed. It was a tough time.
And I mean, people were getting killed, right? I mean, you'd have fights, you'd have alcohol incidents.
There were what caused the company duty officers was some drunk soldier took a chain to a crowd of people coming out of the post movie theater, just randomly going around striking people with chains, and so those kinds of things were happening. There was always the rumor in Lee Barracks about the lieutenant who got put in a wall locker and thrown out the window. I'm never able to validate whether that was true or not, but it was the rumor that they told every new lieutenant that came in, you better behave, lieutenant, or you could go out the window in a wall locker. It was tough times. It was tough times, though.
Oh. Just a quick word from our sponsor, NordVPN, tied in with one of our own combat stories, and we'll get right back to the show. When I was flying Apaches for a deliberate operation in combat, it was my responsibility to keep our ground forces safe. One night, while covering a 3rd Special Forces group hit, we identified insurgents moving on our Green Berets on the ground. We cleared our fires and took care of the threat. I never wanted our brothers on the ground to wonder if we had their backs for security. From when I was at the CIA until today, whether I'm at home or somewhere else in the world working or browsing the web, looking at my banking, or buying something online, I need someone else to protect me, which is why I use NordVPN. NordVPN secures my online activity on a regular basis. It disguises my IP address and allows me to access content I might not be able to from my normal location, and even get better prices on some websites by coming in from another location. It'll scan downloaded files for viruses, block phishing and malware-ridden websites, and is the fastest VPN out there. Please head over to nordvpn.com/combatstory and grab your exclusive NordVPN deal. If you go to nordvpn.com/combatstory, you get a huge discount off your NordVPN plan and 4 additional months for free. It's completely risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. And now, back to our combat story. Did your father give you any advice as you were going through ROTC about, hey, here's how you need to lead? Was it just you learning through watching?
He gave me advice all through as I was growing up about leading and giving me books to read that would point me in the right direction. But quite honestly, once I went to college, he was in Vietnam 2 of the 4 years I was in college, and then he was in Kansas 1 of the years, and actually was nearby in Washington for 1 of the years. So I saw a little bit more of him then. But we really, other than what he did raising me, there was really no opportunity for heavy leadership mentoring. And I guess one of the biggest regrets of my life is never having the opportunity to know my father as a man. I knew him as a kid, but seeing my sons grow up, both of my boys are early 50s now, watching them grow up to be wonderful men and businessmen and fathers and husbands, and I mean that's just one of the great joys of life. And he never had the opportunity to do that. He was 48 when he was killed.
Yeah. Was there a chance that they would send you to Vietnam as you graduated?
Oh, sure. I mean, in fact, that's where I thought I was going. I fully expected to go to my basic officer training down in Benning, and then go straight to Vietnam. That's what I expected. But it's interesting, and I never really appreciated what happened, why I didn't go straight to Vietnam, and until I became the Army Chief of Staff, and what I realized was we were starting to increase the size of the Army. So when you increase the size of the Army, you have to start growing lieutenants 4 years ahead of time, just because it takes them 4 years to get through college. And if you're going to decrease the size of the Army, you got to start phasing out lieutenants 4 years ahead of time. And so I came in the Army and I'm year group 71, and they apparently just made a decision to start taking down the size of the Army. So when we walked into Fort Benning, they offered everybody what they called active duty for training. You could be in the Army for 90 days, and then you spend 8 years in the reserves. Wow. And we had already kind of focused on our 2 years, and so we said, no, we're just going to go ahead and stay in, and then go ahead and get out at the end of the 2 years. But that's what happened. And then so instead of going to Vietnam, they shipped me off to Germany.
Wow. Was there any concern on your end that I'm not going to Vietnam?
No, I mean, if they'd have sent, I wasn't going to volunteer, but if they had sent me, there was no question in my mind. I would have gone.
Wow. And then back to your father, the lessons that he had shared with you growing up, obviously not as pronounced because you didn't spend as much time with him in college. Do you feel like the way that you ended up leading was somehow influenced by anything that you had talked to him about, or was it something you developed on your own that was your own style?
No. I mean, what I tell my sons is that you don't necessarily develop your children by talking to them. You develop your children by letting them watch you do the right things. And so I watched him and watched how he operated, and it was ingrained in me. I mean, as far as, arm around the shoulder, off to the side of the porch kind of thing. I mean, the one thing that really stuck with me that he instilled in me was never be afraid to try to be the very best. And he was a great athlete, college hockey player, captain of the West Point hockey team, and great competitor. Never could figure out how to hit that little white ball on the golf course, though. But he was a great competitor. And that really was something that I shaped my whole leadership style around. I tried every place I went. I tried to make my organization the best that it could possibly be, and that was something that he instilled in me growing up. Even from washing the dishes or cleaning the bathroom, boy, it had to be exactly right.
One of the things that comes out in reading about you is that you put such an emphasis on the soldier. And I'm not just saying this, people might be listening and saying, no. But I think that you hear about this from different general officers throughout their careers, where you can build an effective team, you can make it look like one, but you really invested a lot of time in the people and spending time with the soldiers, platoon sergeants, with the other leaders at an early stage. I don't know if you would agree with that sentiment or if that was something you may have done intentionally, but I'm just curious because there are different ways of going about it.
Look, I'm a people person, and for me, leadership is building a team and achieving and accomplish something nobody on that team thinks you can do, but together you're able to do it. And so leadership for me it's always about people. It's about how you inspire and motivate people to accomplish something that they never had in the world thought they had a chance of accomplishing. And so I invested a lot of time with the people, and I'm a people person anyway. I like people. I love screwing around with the troops. I loved, just going on long runs and stuff with them, and watching the ups and downs. And so, it wasn't hard for me. It was kind of, it fits my personality, and I like people. And I teach leadership in the business school at Cornell, and one of the things that I talk to the students about is, if you look at the companies that did well through the pandemic, they were the ones that put their people first. It's not rocket scientists.
Yeah. I agree.
Rocket science.
Yeah. And you mentioned your personality. I have to say, one of the things that I really liked when I was just getting to understand your background that I never would have expected was not just being a people person, but this idea of life of the party, the hijinks side of you. And I think it humanizes the general officer to know, like every other lieutenant, you had some hijinks. And I was just wondering, I mean, I've heard several that I've read, but any that come to mind? Don't believe any of them. Maybe one with a rugby ball and a window or something.
Oh, who knows? Yeah. I was kind of playful growing up. When you move around so much, 4 high schools in 3 countries, you kind of, one of the things that my mother instilled in us was make the best of it.
Yeah.
And so, every place I went, I tried to make the best of it, and that meant you got to have a little fun while you're suffering through getting to know all these new people and figuring out who you like and who you don't like and everything. But I can't think of any particular playful incident.
No, that's okay. I didn't have any either when I was in Germany as a lieutenant. So yeah. I did want to touch on something in Germany as I think lieutenant, maybe you're a captain, you're in the field, I believe, and you get a call on a radio for some national security event or opportunity.
No, it was Fort Carson.
Carson. Okay. That was it. All right. Yeah. Could you tell us about this?
Yeah. So I was out the company commander, and at that time, the National Training Center was just getting cranked up. And so but you had to bring your own op 4. So my company was going to be the op 4 for the brigade.
And sir, just
So
real quick for those listening, the Op 4 is the opposition force. So the
yeah, there you
National
go.
Training Center is going to be like where you do larger scale um, tactical maneuvers, and you have an enemy force as well that's present.
Yeah, keep me straight on the
Yep.
acronyms there. So anyway, so I'm out in the field training my company in Russian tactics. So we would maneuver like the Russians would, so we could, um, people would work against us. And then my first sergeant comes out and says, um, Major Blackwell from branch called, and infantry branch called, and he said, "You got to call him back right away." And I said, "Well, I'll just call him tomorrow when I get in." I said, "Oh no, sir! Oh no, sir! You got to call him right now." So of course, no cell phones then. So I got to drive to a phone that's hanging on a telephone pole downrange Fort Carson, and I called the guy, and he was pressing me, I guess. So I said, "What's this about? You've been selected for a mission of the highest national importance." And I knew it was Delta Force. They were just forming Delta Force. One of my good friends was in the first selection corps, so I knew what it was about. And I said, "Okay, I got to talk to my wife and my boss here, and I'll call you tomorrow." He said, "No, I got to know by 1 o'clock." So I call my boss on the radio and call my wife on the phone, and they both say, "Okay, go ahead and do it." And so a couple of days later, off I go to Fort Bragg, and I go through the selection program, which was the toughest physical thing that I've ever had to do in my life. But as I'm going through it, I'm having calls with my wife in the evenings, and she had signed up for 2 years, get out and go to law school, and I'm in 8.5, 9 years, and I'm thinking I'm going to do something fundamentally different than what I was doing, and it was clear that it wasn't going to work out for her to have to come to Fort Bragg where she knew no one, and then I'd have to be in a position to say, "I can't tell you where I'm going or when I'm going to be back, but don't worry." And even though she was saying through muffled sobs, "You go ahead and do it
Oh,
if that's what
wow.
you want," but it was clear it wasn't going to work. And so I went in and I told him that no, thank you very much. I appreciate this, and it's not going to work for me. And I'll never forget this. Charlie Beckwith, who was in charge at that time of standing up Delta Force, said to me as I was leaving, he said, "Captain, you're going to go a long way in this man's army, and when you get there, never forget that it takes special people to do special things." And I never forgot that, and he was right.
Why do you think he said that to you?
Don't know, don't know. I was at that time. I had been putting tincture of benzoin on my feet to tighten them up and to toughen them up because we were walking miles every day in the woods. And after I did it for about, I don't know, 2 weeks, I got some type of allergic reaction and my feet swelled up, and so I couldn't even put my boots on. I looked like I had elephantitis of the feet. So I'm walking around the stockade there at Fort Bragg barefoot with these big pink feet from the reaction. So
He saw
anyway,
something in you, though, for sure.
yeah,
And
I guess so. Yeah, he was quite a guy. It was the hardest personal decision that I had to make while I was in the army because it was, you could tell it was going to be a hugely competent and professional organization. It would have been just remarkable to be part of an organization like that. And interestingly, Pete Schoonmaker, who went on to be my predecessor as Army Chief of Staff, and I were in the same selection course, and
wow.
we shared straw in the evenings in the URA forest. I think they had these big tents with just straw on the floor to sleep on. And but it was interesting because you every day you'd wake up, and the night before they would have come in and written on a chalkboard, 7 o'clock, 35 pounds. So you got up you were ready at 7 o'clock with your rucksack packed, had to weigh 35 pounds without the water. and you had a AK-47, or you had a rifle, and you had your rucksack, and they'd take you in a truck and they'd drop you off and they'd say, okay, you're here, go there. And you just keep doing that. And you never know how far you were going to go in the course of a day. You never knew what the standard was. They just said, go as fast as you can. And it was really, really, as I said, the most demanding thing physically that I've had to do.
It's really interesting because we've interviewed several former Delta operators. I don't think that that selection process has changed. There's something about that moving through the woods, gentleman's course, be here on time, be ready, and execute, that seems to have stood the test of time here.
Oh, I mean, Beckwith and Bucky Burris modeled it after the SAS course that they both went through.
Man. You say that it's one of the hardest decisions you make, and you reference the fact that it was, like it was going to be a very competent force. What did it change in your approach going back to the big army, knowing that you were walking away from that? Did it, if anything at all, did it make you more determined? What?
No, it's interesting. I'm a look forward person. You make a decision. You think your way through it. You make the decision, and you look forward and you go on. And so they were just human nature. A couple of times you look back and say, "Gee, maybe I could have been somebody if I went over to Delta Force." But primarily, I just went back and tried to be a very good company commander again.
Yeah,
and that was it. I mean, I really just kind of moved on.
It's a good lesson for the people listening to pay attention to what your spouse says, because you can't do that lifestyle without that person there. So I remember, so it's very funny because as I was reading about that moment, when I was in Germany earlier on in my career, they brought several of the pilots into a room. They brought somebody in, no patches or anything. And he said, I'm from this unit none of y'all have heard of, and it's not 160th. And we're looking for people who have this background, blah, blah, blah. You can tell us by tomorrow if you're interested. And I distinctly remember going home to my new bride, and I said, they got this thing. It's called Flight Concepts. I really want to go do it. She's like, don't even think about it. I didn't sign up for that. And she'll joke now because years later we ended up at the CIA doing crazy stuff there. But I distinctly remember saying no to that and how difficult it was. I don't know if I'm a look forward person to the degree you are, but I appreciate the sentiment there. It makes sense on why you need to do that. But I also knew that I couldn't do this without my wife.
Yep. And, I had made a commitment to her, just like I made a commitment to the Army. And, 20 or 30 years later, I go off to Iraq for a year, get extended twice, and she's back there in the States by herself, but then not only taking care of herself, but working to support Army families and things all across the country. So, things work out.
Yeah. And actually, just speaking of your wife, sir, one of the things I noticed that I think is very common that I had read was this experience she had as a junior officer's wife around some of the more senior officers' wives at the time. It's not an easy place to be.
Yeah.
And my wife had the same experience, a very similar, so I wouldn't say the same, but a similar feeling. I'm curious, like, how did she change that mentality as she was a general officer's wife down the road?
Yeah, it's interesting. And one of the things I learned as a lieutenant was that you have to kind of keep a handle on your wife, because if you don't, they can make spouses, wives very miserable. And we had a battalion commander's wife that did that.
Yeah.
And it almost drove us out of the Army. But Sheila, once the boys went back to school, she worked, and she worked for over my whole career. She worked to include when I was Army Chief of Staff. She was still she was the Chief Operating Officer of the Hill Media Group.
Wow.
And so, it's fascinating. I went in to the first time we went out to Fort Leavenworth to talk to the brigade and battalion, new brigade and battalion commanders and their spouses. And I just went up with her for, for her first talk with the spouses. And she says, "Hi, I'm Sheila Casey. I'm the chief operating officer of the Hill." And all the wives stood up and applauded.
That's great.
And so she is a very efficient person, if I could use that term. And she, she was able to do the support stuff and the job at every level. And she joked that when I was a battalion XO, we got a new battalion commander, and I told him we have a new battalion commander, and she looks at me and says, "He's divorced." And I said, "Yeah, he's divorced." And it took me a second to realize what that meant to her, because it meant to her now that she's the first lady.
Oh, I didn't put that together. Yeah, so it's on her shoulder.
Yeah. So now she's trying to figure it out. But I just, I think, frankly, I think she set a tone for the Army that you can have two careers in the Army.
Yeah.
They don't have to be both in the Army.
Yeah.
And frankly, if they're both in the Army, the Army still need to do a better job of making that comfortable for people to be able to do that.
Just a quick word from one of our sponsors, and we'll get right back to this combat story. It can be so hard to find gifts for other people, particularly folks in your office, your kids, and your friends or family downrange. If you want to avoid boring, basic, and bland gifts this year, Uncommon Goods is your secret weapon. Uncommon Goods is here to make your holiday shopping stress-free by scouring the globe for the most remarkable and truly unique gifts for everyone on your list. And there were several map-related gifts that caught my eye and I would gladly get for folks downrange, a good friend from my hometown or travels, or an asset I needed to impress. I love maps, and they have plenty to choose from in a variety of cool forms. I particularly liked the map serving trays, custom map cufflinks, personalized pushpin world maps, special town map glass set to drink your whiskey in, and many more. Uncommon Goods looks for products that are high quality, unique, and often handmade in the US, which we love. They have the most meaningful, out-of-the-ordinary gifts anywhere. And to get 15% off your next gift, go to uncommongoods.com/combat. That's uncommongoods.com/combat for 15% off. Don't miss out on this limited time offer. Uncommon Goods, we're all out of the ordinary. And now back to this combat story. No, we saw more and more of that. My wife has worked, since we started, with a law degree, and that has always been something that we've watched out for, is how you take care of the spouses in those organizations, because it's so important for the mission. So as you're talking about moving through your career here, sir, I know there's a lot of ground to cover. Can you take us through your experience? I think it was in Kosovo, if I'm getting it right. It seems like you had some formative years or moments in that experience. And this is before 9/11, before what's going to change. Could you talk us through what that experience was like for you?
Yeah. It was really Bosnia first and then Kosovo. But so I was off in Germany as the chief of staff of Fifth Corps at that time, and we were actually training the aviation brigade and matching it up with the it was the 173rd. Then they changed the name. I forget exactly when they changed, but the 173rd from Italy. And we were practicing a mission to go out and extract the UN observers from the eastern enclaves in Bosnia, Zepa, Srebrenica, and Gorazde. And while we were doing that was when they got overrun. That's when Srebrenica happened, and all those people were killed. And we weren't quite totally ready, but we were ready enough to have done it in that environment. But we couldn't get political clearance to move the helicopters into Italy so they could deploy out of there, because you couldn't deploy from Germany. And so that was kind of a big revelation to me. But then we became, once the Dayton Accords occurred and we had to send in the First Armored Division, I mean, Fifth Corps headquarters had to deploy the First Armored Division into Bosnia and set up a support structure for them. And so this was the first really tactical deployment. Now, it wasn't a combat deployment. There was risk involved, but it was, they weren't employing IEDs or shooting at us. They were shooting at each other, and we could be victims of by association. But it was the first combat-like environment that I had to deploy to. So, but I helped deploy the First Armored Division into Bosnia, and then I went down to a base in Hungary when I got promoted to brigadier. So this is my first general officer command, if you will, and I'm commanding the base at Tazar, Hungary. And it basically, we set it up. It was the place where the First Armored Division would come out of Bosnia, and the First Infantry Division would go into Bosnia in a relief in place. And so we had to set up this whole relief in place action as you have one division replacing another. And I did that until I guess I went down there, I don't know, in January of '96, stayed down there until June. And then I went into Bosnia to the First Armored Division to become one of the assistant division commanders. And that was my first real experience in a competitive operational environment. What? And I must say, I learned more about intelligence and tactical intelligence and how to think about it in 6 weeks in Bosnia than I learned in everything else I've done in the military, to include many tours at the National Training Center. It was a hugely formative and educational experience for me.
So what's trying to pick how to say this. So you mentioned that was your first brigadier general command, basically. How much weight or pressure do you feel at that level? Because I think for many people who are never around general officers, you just can't understand what it's like at that level. How much pressure do you have in that role compared to, a more junior role as you're a company commander or battalion commander as you come up through the ranks?
I mean, the issues are all bigger. The task you're trying to accomplish is bigger and more complicated. The risks are greater. But I'll tell you, I think the Army prepared me very well from the time I was a platoon leader in Germany, because they kept putting me in positions where I wasn't qualified to do what I was given the job to do, but I figured it out. And they kept giving me harder jobs, and I kept figuring it out. And that's really kind of what we had to do in Bosnia. I mean, it was fascinating when the First Armored Division was deploying to to Bosnia. Nobody in Europe had done anything as far as deployments go, except to go to Grafenwehr and Hohenfels. So I had just come from being the chief of staff of the First Cavalry Division, where we had put in place a significant deployment SOP and a deployment program to be able to deploy the first Cav rapidly by air or by sea. And Jim Wright, who was the TACOM commander, and I would say to these guys, "You guys don't know what you're doing when it comes to deployment." They'd say, "Well, we go to Graf. Yeah, we know all about this stuff." And it was a goat rope. I don't know if it was not. And this is a good idea gone bad. So someone had the idea that we could rent these East German train cars, and we could put two cars and with a bunch of flatbeds, and we could put a tank company together. Well, the East German rail cars didn't have heat, didn't have water. I mean, they were just decrepit. And so there's a picture in the New York Times of our troops stuck on a train at a siding someplace between Germany and Croatia. And they're writing backwards on the foggy windows saying, "Help us. We have no heat or no food." but we got through it, but it was really really painful, and we all learned a lot from it. But and another big learning experience there.
And I think I had read about an uprising of some sort in Kosovo that you are some part of.
No, it was Bosnia.
That was Bosnia. Okay.
That was
Can you
Bosnia.
speak to that?
It was a place called Usici, and it was a Usici was a Bosniak village that was on the Serb side of the inner entity boundary line. And the inner entity boundary line was drawn as part of Dayton. And there was a long-term plan for people to be able to resettle back into their homes on the other side of the boundary, but the modalities for that weren't even close to being worked out. So one night, the group of Bosniaks, who some of which were from that village, snuck back into their house under the cover of darkness with weapons and occupied the town. Well, the Serbs went crazy, and they all came running up to the Serb police came running up to throw them out. We had to stop them, and we got everybody separated. And then I spent literally 6 weeks going back and forth between the Bosniaks and the Serbs, trying to negotiate so the Bosniaks could occupy the city in a correct way, and that the Serbs would accept their presence on the inner entity boundary on the other side. So we go through this whole process. I finally get the Serbs to agree that if they can come in and search the town and find no weapons, the Bosniaks can stay. So I go into the leaders, I get all the leaders together, and I say, okay, look, we've been working at this for 6 weeks. The Serbs are coming in tomorrow at 10 o'clock. Get the weapons out of town, and you can stay. Yes, General. Yes, General. Okay. So 10 o'clock comes, they hang up, they run up a Bosnian flag. There's a little kerfuffle as the Serbs tear the flag down. But they search. They're searching the whole place, and they're not finding anything. So we're like 5 minutes from closing the deal, and the deputy mayor invites us to come up into his house for tea. Me, the Serb Minister of Interior, and the Serb Chief of Police. So this is like having Darth Vader and his brother in for tea. So we're in there, and we're having tea. I mean, we're literally minutes from shaking hands. And a Serb policeman walks out of the next room with 2 guns, a bag of grenades, and a bag of bullets. And I look at this guy. I go, I was flabbergasted. And so we had told the Serbs that if they catch weapons, they can arrest the guy. I finally said, I told them, we'll bring them down tomorrow. You guys just leave. It's getting dark. We got to get everybody out of here, and we'll sort this out in the morning. Well, I go back to we get everybody out of there. I go back to walk into my boss, Bill Nash, the 2-star. And I know when I walked in, I looked crestfallen. And he looked at me and said, George, never forget, it's their country. And that was a huge, huge lesson for me that I took into Iraq. You can't want it more than they do.
Sir, why were you crestfallen? I think I know, but I just would love to hear a bit more here.
Because I had worked so hard to get it done, and these people could have gone back to their homes. I mean, I worked 6 weeks to make something I thought positive happen for these people, and that was my job. And they blew it.
So it wasn't that you had not gotten your achieved goal, like you didn't. It wasn't like I failed in this. It was more these people don't now have an opportunity to go home.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I tried not to. I always try not to make things about me.
Yeah. So I have to imagine that had to have been like you described the intel side of things. That had to have been a teaching in geopolitics on another level in a short period of time, I would imagine.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It was that was funny. So a couple of days before that, one of the things the Serbs did was they said that, okay, if they're going to stay, they have to leave and be gone for at least 24 hours, and then they can come back. So the village leaders, they realized that they didn't want to tell the people this, so they had me tell the people through an interpreter. So we're all in the little town square, and they bring up the general to tell the people. And so I tell the people, it's translated and everything, and the women from the village come up and they're hitting me with these big brooms, and it had it on video. So I took it back to the battalion update in that evening, and I was giving my report, and I said, well, I had a very good day in Usici. I told them that they had to leave, and I had them eating out of the palm of my hands. And then I pressed the button. They played the video of me getting hit with the brooms.
On cue.
Yeah.
Oh, geez.
It's funny. You can laugh about these things now.
Yeah. These are things that I feel like there's oftentimes I'll talk to people about the time in the military or the government. There are certain things that seem to only happen in those environments that you just cannot believe unless you're there. And it's moments like getting hit by brooms by people in a village. So you mentioned being in a senior role at 1st Cav, and obviously your father had commanded that unit. What was the feeling for you when you moved into that role?
Well, that's kind of a story in itself. So, everybody thinks if you're a 4-star general, your career just goes like that.
They do think that.
Not so fast. Not so fast. So I had thought I did a very good job in battalion command, went off right to the War College. But then the first colonel's list came out, and I wasn't on it. And then the next year, the second colonel's list comes out, and I'm not on that. And so I'm thinking, okay, you're done. And I thought I was so done that I put cash down on an executive MBA program at George Washington. I literally had one foot out the door. And then I got a call from John Tolelli, the commander of the 1st Cav then, who I'd never met. And he says, would you like to be my chief of staff? I said, yes, sir. Yeah, that'd be fine. And he said, well, can you come for an interview? And I went, he was at Fort Leavenworth for something, and I went out and met him there and had a 20-minute interview.
Just 20 minutes?
20-minute interview with someone that was the first time I'd met him. And a month later, he called me up and said, when can you be here? And then the next colonel list came out, and I was on it. And then the brigade command list came out, and I was on it. And I would brigade command, and I left brigade command to go be the chief, the G3 at 5th Corps, and then moved up to be the chief of staff at 5th Corps. And brigadier general list came out, and I was on that. So I went from having one foot out the door to brigadier general in the course of like 2 years.
Jeez,
crazy.
What influenced his decision? Did somebody say, "Hey, we got to keep this guy in here," or "You need this guy in the unit"?
I don't know. I mean, I actually have asked him. In fact, I was at the time I was working for the General Vono was the chief of staff, and I was in a kind of a small group that he had working for. And I asked General Tellez, did General Vono have anything to do with this? And he said no. And I years later, I asked General Vono if he had anything to do with it, and he said no. I'm not sure I entirely believe either one of them, but if you look at General Tellelli's background, he was in the same position I was. He had been passed over for brigade command a couple of times. And then Crosby Sink picked him up to be his chief. And he went on, obviously, to be a 4-star general himself. And I just think he was trying to pay back a little bit.
Wow.
To do the same thing for someone else that somebody did for him. He's a wonderful, wonderful guy. And that's the kind of thing he'd do. But there wasn't.
Wow. With this mentality that I'm picking up of you not looking back, and you seem to roll with the punches incredibly well. The fact that your name isn't on the list, I think, would be very difficult for many people to handle that first time around, the second time around. How did you handle that, sir?
So it's even a little bit worse than that, because I had worked with the colonel who was the head of over Milperson. So he was like the head of the officer division. And I ran into him going up the stairs in the Pentagon. And he goes, "Hey, George, congratulations." Gave me the thumbs up. It was Rusty Casey who was on the list, not me.
No.
Yeah.
Jeez.
So anyway, so it was hard. It was hard. And, the it's obviously disappointing when you're not on the list, but when you look at the other people that are on the list, that's when it gets really hard. You go, him?
You know them all,
me?
right? You have to
Yeah,
know
you
every
know
one
them
of
all.
these
Sure.
people.
You go, what? But anyway, you get over it. And if you let it be all about you, it gets really hard. But if it's not about you, if it's about the organization doing the best you can for the organization, then it gets somewhat easier. It's still hard, and it's still disappointing. But you move on.
Just out of curiosity, where does that trait come from for you? I mean, was it something you saw or just developed?
I think it's all the moving around we did as kids, and my mother just always make the best of it.
Yeah.
Can we go to the Mom? Can we go to the playground? No, play outside in the yard. There's no grass in the yard. Make the best of it.
Yeah.
That kind of stuff. I mean, life is too short to spend a lot of time dwelling on all the negative things that happen. They're going to happen.
Yeah. I just feel like it's a very unique trait. And so you mentioned the backstory there. You're at First Cav. What does it feel like going in to that unit, knowing your father's history with it?
Yeah. I mean, and it's an absolutely terrific unit with great traditions. And so, the first time you walk in the door, it's kind of, wow, and then as it turned out, they had the pictures of the former chiefs of staff on the wall just as I walked out of my office. So every day I walked out and there he was staring right at me, and so it was initially something that you I kind of savored, actually.
Yeah.
But then anyone who's been a chief of staff will tell you the train gets going so fast that you just hang on.
Nobody's cutting you any slack, I presume.
You don't have time to smell the flowers.
I understand from hearing other folks who have been chief of staffs or general's aides along the way, that can be a pretty important position from a learning perspective. Not saying that was for you. It sounds like it was, but as you look back on your career, sir, what is one of the most formative leadership experiences you had that where you felt like you really grew from a leadership perspective?
Well, certainly chief of staff was a key job, but I think the job that really prepared me for the 4-star jobs that I would have was when I was a brigadier, when I came back from Bosnia, and I became the deputy J5 who had the European portfolio, and in that position, I mean, so Bosnia was very much on people's radar back then. It was really kind of the only game in town, except for occasionally when Saddam Hussein started shooting at our airplanes. But Bosnia was kind of in the forefront, and I was one of the few people in Washington that had actually been there and served there, and so I got to go to a lot of deputies meetings. So I got a real thorough understanding of the interagency process. I worked very closely with the Bosnia Task Force up in Department of Defense, the Office of Secretary of Defense. And I really saw how the national security apparatus of the United States worked together. And then as we as Bosnia and Kosovo flared up, my boss, Ed Anderson, who was the J5, had to have back surgery right as we were making the decision to go to war against Serbia for Kosovo. So I became the backbencher for the vice chairman going to the deputies meetings, and the chairman going to the National Security Council meetings. And boy, was that an education. I mean, I remember sitting there, and the National Security Advisor, Sandy Berger. This is
Wow.
making the decision to go to war or not. And everybody in a lot of people in the room were talking about all the negative possibilities if we decided to start bombing Serbia. And so Sandy Berger said, are you telling me that the consequences of this are so grave that we shouldn't even start? And there's this long silence. And Tom Pickering, the Deputy Secretary of State, speaks up and says, look, this guy is going to go in there and destroy Kosovo sooner or later. And so if we don't do it now, we're going to have to do it later. So we might as well do it now at a time and place of our choosing. And everybody kind of went, yeah. And there we went. But I mean, this is after weeks of discussion. So it wasn't just a one-time shot. People had been thinking about this and working on this, but that was the key point where it all changed.
That's amazing. Yeah.
But that whole experience that I guess I was 2 years. I was there for 2 years, and then the last part of it, I spent on Strobe Talbot's small group that was negotiating the end of the Kosovo War. So I was there at the beginning of it to hear the decision to go, but then Talbot went over and negotiated the end of the war with Viktor Chernomyrdin, the former prime minister of Russia. And they had the president of Finland, Matti Ahtisaari, there as a kind of honest broker. And so they'd sit at a table, and there'd be three of them, and there'd be an empty chair. And that was Milosevic. And what the agreement was when Talbot and Chernomyrdin agreed that this was the final settlement, then Ahtisaari and Chernomyrdin would fly off to Belgrade and tell Slobodan that was it. He was done, which is exactly what happened. And they took it down to him, and he said, "I have to get it to Parliament." And he took it to Parliament the next day, and that was the end of the war. But it was a crazy, crazy time.
So I had never really thought of this, just because I was brought up in the post 9/11 era. I mean, I was there as that was happening. I was in college learning about this stuff, but I mean, you saw and were part of a war that ended like that. I mean, did that feel good to see it end on those terms, sir?
It always feels good when wars end, and especially when you're successful. But boy, back to your original point. It's a hugely broadening experience, and I'll tell you a story that I went through there that relevant today in the dealings with Russia. So we were in Moscow with this Strobe Talbot's team, and we just finished our work, and we're getting ready to fly back to the United States, when one of the guys on our team got a call from someone who knew who was working with the Russian battalion in Priboj, Bosnia. And they said, "Hey, this battalion is packing up to go to Serbia." So we went in and told Secretary Talbot, and he went by the foreign ministry on the way out and said, "Hey, what's going on?" And they said, "Don't worry, that's just preparations. Nobody's doing anything." So we get on a plane and we're flying home. And we're like 15 minutes from leaving Russian airspace. And we get a call saying that battalion has crossed the border and is going into Serbia. So we do the Colombian coffee bean commercial where we make the U-turn in the sky and head back to Moscow. And we go into see the foreign minister. And he keeps Secretary Talbot standing in the hall for an hour. But we're all standing around the hall for an hour. And we go in and see him. And he said, they're just going to go position themselves north of Serbia. So when you go in from the south, they'll come in from the north. And he said, let's go see the defense minister and the chief of defense and talk about Russian participation in the peacekeeping force. So we all go over to the Ministry of Defense, and they take us into this large conference room that it's just dark. The wood's dark, the tables are dark, the chairs are dark, the curtains are dark. It's just dark. And they have these 3 wall-size pictures of the great Russian victories, and it's over the Tartars, the Napoleon, and the Germans. But they go along the whole wall of huge conference room, and we're there for 12 hours, and we're alternately discussing the role of the Russian participation in the peacekeeping force, and then they're accusing us of going into Kosovo. And so they're accusing us of, as it turns out, exactly what they were doing. I mean, and Strobe Talbot had to get on the phone with the vice chairman and say, would you tell these Russians that we're not going into Kosovo? But it's exactly what they were doing. So after 12 hours, so it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon till 4 o'clock in the morning, we're in there having these discussions. And the meeting breaks up. The Russians walk out. Our guys, Talbot's guys, come in from the back room and say, CNN is reporting that the Russians are in Pristina at the airfield. So Talbot says, get the foreign minister back here. He comes down, comes in and says, no, this is a big mistake. I will make a statement to that effect on CNN. So nobody was in the Moscow bureau because it's 4 o'clock in the morning. So we had to call Atlanta. So this is crazy. So we're sitting there with CNN on the phone in Atlanta, and Phil Goldberg and John Bass, 2 of state foreign service officers working for Strobe Talbot, and I are helping the foreign minister draft his statement that he's going to read on CNN about why the Russian forces really weren't on the airfield in Kosovo. It was the most bizarre 12 hours I think I spent in my entire career. But the important thing is they lied through their teeth to us the entire time.
Were they just buying time, you think, while this was going on, having the brass in a room
I do.
contained?
Yeah, no, I do. For some reason, yes. That's what they were trying to do. And it's interesting. The next day in the papers, in the Russian papers, it was almost it was the best thing the Russian military had done probably since the end of World War II. They were just ecstatic at what they'd done. One battalion.
Yeah. Jeez. So I just want to talk about Iraq for a bit if we can. I think you mentioned it. You were extended a few times. And I think there's a pretty special story of you actually deciding to go there, talking it over with Sheila before taking that role. I was hoping you could share that.
I don't know how special it is, but we. So I'll never forget the timing. So I was the vice chief. Pete Schoonmaker was the chief. He came into my office one Monday morning and said, okay, they're getting ready to replace Rick Sanchez. I need the names of 3 and 4 stars who you think are capable of taking over that job by the end of the day. I said, okay. So I put the list together, take the list over. We're sitting on the front porch there at quarters 1. And he's looking at the list. And he looks at it and says, for a while, and he says, your name's not on here. And he said, do you think you can do this? I said, of course I can. But I said, we just started this big organizational transformation of the Army, and you said you wanted me to stay here with you and see that through. And he just nodded, didn't say anything. And that was it. So I think the next day or so, John Avizade comes into my office, and he said, do you know what's going on? I said, no, what? And he says, there's 3 names going to the White House to replace Sanchez. You, Dave McKiernan, and me. And I said, ooh. So I made the decision not to tell Sheila because it wasn't a sure thing. And we decided the moving van had actually started moving us on Monday, and we were delayed moving into the vice's quarters on Fort McNair, and we were still in the quarters where I was the director of the Joint Staff. So anyway, the moving van was moving us over to Fort McNair while this is all going on. And I guess it's about Thursday evening. They have the meeting with the president, and I'm in the chief's office with Dick Cody and Jim Lovelace, and the Abizaid calls from the White House and says the president made the decision Casey's going to Iraq. So Pete Schoonmaker hangs up and said, "You're going to Iraq." I went, "Wow, okay." And then Schoonmaker, to his credit, said, "Look, this is the most important thing you're going to do in your career. So pass off your vice duties to Dick Cody and move out and prepare yourself." And I said, "Great." So now I got to tell Sheila. So I get in the car and I go home and to Fort McNair now, because the last moving van has just left like a couple hours before. And I come home and she's up on the third floor unpacking boxes. And in my suave infantry way, I said, "Dear, stop unpacking and sit down. I have something to tell you." And she got this terrible look on her face. And I said, "I'm going to Iraq." And she burst into tears. And I always, I kid her that I've never been sure whether she was crying because I was going to Iraq or she was going to have to move back onto Fort Myer. So anyway, so that was what, as I said, that wasn't a very special one, but that's how it happened. And then to her credit, I went back and told the next day, and I said, "Okay, got it. We're all together." And Pete Schoonmaker says, "Well, what's she going to do?" And I said, "Well, we're just going to leave the stuff in the boxes and move it right back into the house we just left." And he said, "Oh, don't do that. Just stay there." And Dick Cody was standing there, and he was going to replace me as the vice. And he said, "I don't want to move." And Jim Lovelace, who was the director, said, "I don't want to move." And so I told Sheila that, and she's smart enough to call their wives and say, "Hey, your husbands are giving your houses away. What do you think?" And they said, "No, that's great by us." So they let her stay in that house the whole time I was in Iraq, and it was a huge burden off my mind. That's because great. It was a very secure place, and but that's how it happened. And then,
did you agree with Schoonmaker's assessment that would be the most important role that you took in your career?
Oh yeah, sure, yeah. I mean, you're trying to help a nation of 25 million people recover from 35 years under a dictator and form a democracy. Yeah.
What was the weight of that command on you, sir?
It was a heavy one. It was a heavy one, but I'll tell you what. I find that people put a lot of unnecessary pressure on themselves, and if you just focus on trying to do the best you can at the job that you're given, that consumes enough intellectual and emotional energy that you don't have time to fret over what's going on. When I went in there, the president and Secretary Rumsfeld gave John Negroponte and I, the ambassador, gave us 30 days to come back and brief a plan for our success. And so, we went through a very tough 30 days trying to get our feet on the ground, trying to build a relationship with this new Iraqi government that was 3 days old that we never met. And then we had the flare up in Najaf toward the end of that 30 days. It was pretty all consuming, but I was driven by the need to be able to clearly tell the troops what it was I wanted them to accomplish. I wanted them to be clear about what the heck they were doing there. and how we were going to do it. And that was more important to me than being wrong. And so that's, I mean, kind of just powered through that. And when we did it, you know, the old adage of the old Army saying about there's only two kinds of plans: those that might work and those that won't work. So,
I have not heard that, sir. I've not heard that.
Okay.
I like that.
It's true, because we're human. The best we're going to do is a plan that might work. And then you have old Helmut von Moltke coming in, you know, that no plan survives first contact with mankind. So you have a plan that only might work, and you know it's going to change. And so we planned on it, the thing evolving, but we needed to get something out and get people focused as quick as we could. And that consumed my time rather than sitting around wringing my hands about whether it was right or wrong.
How about maybe separately from that, the idea that the decisions you're making, as you said, larger scale as you move up, and you're at the top here, you got soldiers executing this plan at scale. How are you able to detach from the day-to-day people, you know, KIAs and what's going on at that tactical level to just keep a clear head?
You have to. You have to. I mean, you know, every day I reviewed the casualty figures and saw what, you know, watch what was going on, and every night I prayed for the troops. But you know, I had to stay focused on the larger mission. And you know, one of my old deputies gave me a Sun Tzu calendar, and one of the days, the quote was, "Enlightened leaders make decisions with a clear mind and a pure heart." And that's how I try to make my decisions, with a clear mind. I tried to get the best information available. I tried to pull in diverse and dissenting opinions about what we were doing, and people coming at it from a different perspective. But I had to be able to look myself in the mirror and say, I did my best as humanly possible to get the best information to be able to make this decision. And then pure heart. I had to be able to look myself in that same mirror and say, I'm doing this because I believe it's the absolute right thing to do to accomplish the mission that we've been given at this time. And if I could say I did this with a clear mind and a pure heart, that gave me the conviction that the plan might work, and that gave me the courage to go ahead and execute.
Yeah. And I will get you out of here shortly because I've taken a lot of your time. Just a couple other things here. One is, as you look back at this long career,
you're right. It does go fast.
It goes fast. And you've got a lot of material, sir, so it's hard to pick and choose here. But
you know what the old saying about war stories, right? Nothing screws up a good war story like an eyewitness. Lots of eyewitnesses out there.
I've not heard that either. But there are a lot of
stick with me, Ryan. I'm trying to broaden you.
Thank you. As a pilot, we rarely tell true stories anyway, so I'm used to these things. As you look back at this long career, is there one or maybe two moments that you reflect on as either that day, that event, that was great? Like I really look back on that like, wow, I'm so glad I was a part of that moment.
Yeah. The purple fingers. Remember the first election in Iraq?
Yes.
January of 2005. The Iraqis had to dip their fingers in indelible purple ink when they voted, so they couldn't vote twice. And they were all walking around holding those purple fingers up to the international cameras and talking about what it meant to be able to freely vote for whoever you wanted to vote for after 35 years under Saddam Hussein. It was, and that meant so much because 5 months before that, when they said you need to facilitate free, secure elections in Iraq in 5 months, we all went, how are we going to do that? But we worked at it. We laid out some plans, some milestones, and every time we hit those milestones, we celebrated them. We got more confident, and we got there. But I'm just here to tell you, it wasn't a given, and that's probably why it's so meaningful.
Yeah.
That's I had every major network news anchor from the United States in town, and they are all saying there's no way that this is going to happen. And Secretary Rumsfeld called that night after it was clear that they had been successful, and he said, "When the eyes of the world were on you, you stood and delivered." And I passed that down to the troops because that's what they did. They made this really. It was shaky. It was shaky, and but that really sticks in my mind as one of the things that I'm most proud of, because we gave 25 million people the opportunity for a better life.
Love that. So there's two questions I like to ask everybody, sir, before I get you out. I do want to make sure you've got a USO shirt on. I know you sit on many boards. You help out in so many ways. Is there any particular organization or cause that you would like to just share with the thousands of people that'll listen to this?
Sure. Well, I'm chairman of the board of the USO and have been, I think, for about 7 years. And we're really ratcheting up support in Eastern Europe, and we can use all the help you folks can give us to take care of that. But the second thing that I share is, I just published a book with a Georgetown University professor here about how we need to think differently about veterans after 50 years of a volunteer force. The 1st of July next year will be the 50th anniversary of the volunteer force. Wow. And frankly, you don't do anything for 50 years without figuring out how to do it smarter, better. And I think it's time we need to flip the narrative about veterans. And if you think about what the narrative is about veterans today, it's mostly negative. I mean, people have a positive view of veterans, but what you see on television and what you hear about Congress doing, it's all about veterans with problems, suicide, homelessness, those kinds of issues. When the reality is, the volunteer force has now for almost 50 years recruited from the top 25 to 30% of the 17 to 24-year-old cohort. And, so the people that are coming into the military these days are really, really top caliber people. And the experience they get in the military, from just the military training that they get and from the leadership responsibilities that they have, set them up to contribute to success in society. Yet the veterans themselves are unsure of their ability to succeed in the civilian world. And a lot of people in the civilian world think that if they serve, they're going to come out damaged. I just read a DOD survey that said that they did as a result of this kind of recruiting crisis that everyone's having. But 57% of the young people that they surveyed felt that if they served in the military, they'd have an emotional or psychological problem when they left. That's crazy. What people don't realize is the more people than that in the military have growth experiences, because they're stressed and they come out stronger. And you know that you probably experienced it yourself. So anyway, time to flip the narrative. Talk about the positive aspects of military service means.
Sir, what's the book that you just wrote? I can't even believe I didn't see this.
Oh,
yeah.
Supporting veterans after 50 years of a volunteer force. We could probably use a little public affairs help.
Yeah, you got it. So we're starting here. I think you're going to get some orders coming in. We'll make sure we link to it.
It's a fascinating. It's almost a history of veterans issues. Lots of good facts and figures in there, and how the demographics of veterans are changing, and the population is declining as the World War II and the Vietnam era veterans pass from the scene. It's about a little more than half of them are volunteer force vets. But the demography is changing substantially, and the minorities are increasing both in the military and as a result in the veteran population, and it's a much more diverse population. So anyway, lots to do. That's the other thing.
Perfect. Okay, so the two questions here, and then I'll get you out. One
I thought
is,
that was the two questions.
oh, no, I'm sorry. This is it. I promise. These are two that I ask everybody. One is there anything that you carried with you when you were deployed in the field away from your house that you always wanted to have with you, whether it was a good luck charm, something religious, something that somebody gave you that had sentimental value?
Yeah. I had two things. I had a St. Christopher medal that my dad had on him when the helicopter crashed that I had,
Wow.
and then I had a combat rosary from an Australian friend of mine that he carried in Vietnam, and he gave it to me when I went to Iraq, and I carried it with me the whole time that I was in Iraq, and I used it every night, as a matter of fact. And then the sad thing, I mean, he wanted to give it to his son when I got back, and I mailed it back to him. But when it was going through the X-ray machines, it must have looked weird to somebody, and it never got back to
Oh,
him. So
no.
yeah. But those are the two things
Got it.
that I had with me.
Perfect. And then just the last thing here, sir, that I ask everybody is, as you look back at that career, the sacrifice, and I know you reading casualty reports at the level that you were was probably very difficult. But everything that you went through for those years, would you go back and do that again?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, um, I have no qualms about anything that I did, and I wear this. I still wear this bracelet. It has the name of a Sergeant First Class Rand Lamerson who was killed while I was in Iraq, and I wear it just to remind me of the human cost of war, and it was something that was always heavy on my mind in Iraq obviously because of my father,
Yeah.
and that I just finished reading a book called Mosquito Bowl, and it's about a football game that was played by the Marines on Guadalcanal, but over Christmas one year. But he does an absolute wonderful job of framing the characters who ultimately died on Okinawa, and articulating the loss of what these men didn't have and their losses to the world. So we can never forget those who served.
Thank you very much, sir. I really appreciate the time. Thank you for sharing this. We'll get the links out so people can find the book. Thank you for sharing this with us.
Okay, great, Ryan. Thanks very much. I'm sorry the yard team just showed up with the blowers.
Nope, it's good timing. I hope you enjoyed that combat story. Got a couple of listener comments I wanted to get to. The first is on YouTube, and it's from Probably Trying to Sleep, and it was from the Derek Natalini interview. He says, "This is easily one of the best podcasts in existence, where each episode is consistently entertaining and informative. Ryan's skills in interviewing and leaving no figurative stone unturned in questioning just makes for great content. All that being said, as a guitarist, this jam room is outstanding. That gold top Les Paul is beautiful." So for those who just listen and haven't seen this on YouTube, when we interviewed Derek, behind him were just 7 or 8 beautiful guitars hanging on the wall. So I think if you are musically inclined, you want to take a look. For those like myself, I think it's somewhat lost on me, but my kids were telling me that these are pretty good guitars. So, but thank you for sharing this. Thank you for the kind words just about how we do these interviews and how we try to dig in. Personally, I felt that interview with Derek was one of the best we've done. I don't know if we've gotten that deep with that many experiences of combat with somebody from the Delta ranks. So he's done so much, very accomplished, and it comes through. So thank you for leaving that comment. The next one is from someone named JJ, also a YouTube comment, and it's on the Jason Lilly interview. He says, "Going through a bit of a tough time myself. I cannot overstate how much listening to these stories means to me. These are people who have laid everything on the line countless times and prevailed through everything, the nastiest situations anyone could ever experience, that anyone could throw at them. They come out victors in their own right. Helps me keep my head straight and mind right and how minute my own rough going is. And you're definitely not alone with that. I really appreciate you putting it out there so eloquently. because I think a lot of people feel that way. And it's great to hear how rough things could be compared to our own day-to-day lives. Not to discount how hard day-to-day can be, but there's something about the perspective you get going through these experiences and hearing them from these other people who don't come out feeling great about it and are still questioning what they did or didn't do in the past, myself included. So I take that away from these as well. There are days when I'm out there or I'm working out or I'm at the office and I have to mentally force myself to think back to some of these experiences that we've heard from people to put my own experience of that day into perspective. So thanks for taking the time to leave that comment. Thank you all for listening. Hope you really enjoyed this one. This was a special one for me. And I hope it came through for you all too. Stay safe.